So I first of all wanted to just very intentionally thank this remarkable group of people who I think have brought wonderful knowledge to all of us. It's a very messy subject, and yet it's a very rich subject, and that's the best kind of subject there is, rich and messy, and they've demonstrated that. I think they've also brought enormous clarity to our thinking, but also raised a lot of questions, which is, again, the perfect sort of thing. Maurice, I hope you can come up if you can. So first of all, I'd just like to thank them very much and give them a round of applause. And I'd like to thank Hank Ovink here, who has been a wonderful partner in so many ways over the years and for being so very, very helpful with this conference as well. And so I'd like to start, Hank, with just asking you a question, which is, what do you think?
This is of course not working.
Right. I think you just have it off because you're thinking what the answer is.
Yeah, well. It's on?
Great.
It's on. No, it's not on.
No, it doesn't sound it. No. It's not on, so can we have...
Yeah. Take that. Does it work? Yeah. Yeah, this worked. Better. So what do you think?
Why don't you go over there?
Huh, you're on there. One is, and we've been hearing about this, talking about it, illustrating about it, that the process in how public space is developed is changing. And then again, there are so many experts in their expertise isolated, I almost would say, is that I find it very hard to believe, some of you, that this process of making public space is actually changing. Is it actually possible to do that? I know it is. We've experienced it, but still, you present cases that are not always convincing that the process really changed. So I think we have to question ourselves over and over again. How do you actually engage, not only with your neighbor experts, but what's really going on the ground? How do you really confront politics, perhaps, interest, market, in such a sense that public space becomes public place, because that it becomes meaningful, not for the designer or the developer, but for people. So I find that hard. The second is, actually, I still don't know what public space is. So we've been talking about this for, well, quite a long period of hours with a lot of experts. And it's not the public that is disturbing me, it's space that's disturbing me. I find the word space in public space, I think, the most disturbing word. So I just thought, for me, I will call it public place, which makes much more sense. And the third, and that's a question to Gerald as well as to you, we talk about, and I heard a lot about, existing public space. How it works, good public space, bad public space, good developers, bad developers, good designers, bad designers, good theorists, bad theorists, good politicians, bad politicians, and the whole world in between. But it's so hard to influence the existing. And in Europe, I'm from Europe, I have to relate sometimes to where I come from, we don't build so much new. The biggest question in Europe is rebuild the existing. And we don't grow, we shrink, we age quite a lot. So everything that's there is unfit for the demand. But we're not going to build new, the only thing we're going to do is renew. So the change of the existing is also a different type of development. So influencing by design, by development, by investments, by governance is becoming more and more complex and more important. So how can you actually influence the existing through public place?
It's an excellent question, and of course it tends to divide the world between the global south and everything else, because there is this, again, in the oversimplifications that we need to do to survive, to write, to think, to research. That's why we do have, words like public and private, and I mean, because otherwise it's just, there's only so many things we can hold in our head at one time. There's only so much we can write, and that's why, Annette, I think words like, ownership still do matter, or private ownership, or even private property, because even thinking about Hank's question about how do we sort of retrofit or deal with the existing, so much of the existing actually exists, in the form of ownership, whether it be private or public. So instantaneously, when you get into the implementation mode, the practical mode, how are we going to really affect this? You're suddenly thinking, who do I have to actually deal with to change something? And one of the sort of easy, oversimplified things to do is to go to the owner and say, okay, how can I get you to change things, to do something that, by the way, whether we're an environmental determinist or not, we do believe to some degree, I suppose, that the built environment can be fashioned in a way that will be an improvement for society, that will, it's not that we're trying to necessarily determine, although we're trying to, at a minimum, we could say a soft environmental determinism, I suppose, which is to provide a built environment, a vessel, in which good things can happen. Be socially constructed, perhaps, but at least we have to almost, at a minimum, provide a built environment for that. So I think what ends up happening in an implementation of what we really want, which is a sort of better world, and it's the means to the end that many people in this building do, or the people who are dealing with the built environment, is to try and shape that to produce a better place where people can live, work, and play more equitably, more productively, and have a happier life, ultimately. And then we oversimplify with terms, we divide by professions, we're deeply path dependent, and we're stuck in our silos, and then we come together for a day and a third and exchange ideas, and then hopefully go back, maybe less siloed, but we're still going to use these oversimplifications, I think, and I don't know that that's a bad thing. I think that's a reality. Anybody can respond, and Blair, you seem to have the microphone.
Gerald, let me try to put a hard edge on soft environmental determinism. This is an issue that I confronted when I was writing a series of articles about the public housing projects in Chicago, and confronting the question of, did the housing projects cause the turmoil that led to violence and other things by themselves, or were there other factors? And clearly there were other factors. The distinction that I think is important is the distinction between the potential environment and the effective environment. The potential environment is what designers and clients and the culture create, and it's full of intent. It may have intent for control or joy, but it is not final authorship. Final authorship is the effective environment and how the environment is used, and that often has serendipity in it, surprises of all sorts that designers like Mies van der Rohe or Jaume Plensa in designing the Crown Fountain simply do not anticipate.
Correct.
But the point is that design, your point is that design matters. It does not determine the outcome, the effective environment, but it can open the door to a whole series of behaviors or not. It can create encounter, as Oscar Newman once showed in Defensible Space, or it can prevent it. And in public space, this is crucial, and I think this is the kind of middle course between full autonomy or design doesn't matter at all. There's a certain modesty, but there's also a certain reality in a way that design does have an impact on what we do. It's not the biggest impact necessarily, but it's a critical impact.
And would you mind, Blair, if I amended the word design, just so it's not misunderstood, to talk about the physicality of the built environment? So this is not captured by any profession or any methodology. It's just because there's so many people and things that produce the built environment in its physical manifestation. I don't even want to use the word form. Jonathan. Oh, I'm sorry, and then Jeff. Or either, I don't care, whoever's going to go first.
All right, okay, I'll go first, sorry. just kind of in response to Hans' comments that, so what's new? I think I actually find a lot of new things everywhere I go, and even in Europe. I was in Vienna recently.
Even in Europe.
Yeah, I was.
I find them too.
Yeah, I was in Vienna recently, and there's a program that the planning department in the city runs, which is called the Simply Multiple program, and it's a kind of an unconventional program. Instead of planning for new spaces, the point is to find the hidden places in the city, and do the sort of kind of matchmaking between groups that are looking for space and space that are being underutilized. And it has been phenomenally successful, and it's new kind of planning practice I think we need to look at. And then similarly in city of Seoul in Korea, the new mayor has initiated a new program called city sharing. And basically, again, this kind of a variation of kind of privately owned public space, but finding underutilized private spaces and find new public uses for them. So just two examples of new stuff that's happening.
But so are you suggesting, Jeff, though, use of sort of digital, web-based information, for example, to help people to navigate a new city? In other words, to view all of this as an expansion of what we can do with the existing city, just as an example.
The digital might be a medium, but I think it's really kind of the human kind of knowledge of where those spaces are, and the agencies of people actually, creating these activities and using those spaces.
So following on Annette's plug for her book, which I encouraged her to do, she didn't do it herself, I want to put in a plug for something that tries to do this a little bit, even as I'm not actually satisfied with what I'm about to tell you about, which is the webpage called apops.mas.org, apops.mas.org, which is a webpage that I've been involved in creating, along with some colleagues here, Alexis Taylor, this organization, this not-for-profit, this NGO that I created, which was to, in fact, publicize all 525 or so privately owned public spaces in New York City. And we mounted this webpage. We have data on all of them, photographs, descriptions, site plans, all of the legal data, and we're going to have a lot more. And please go and look at it, although in 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, it'll have a completely new design. Why? Because the web designers came up with this idea of our presenting information to the public, whereas our idea was to get information from the public, and that's the final interface. And if you want to see a before and after, at least in terms of the way we think about it, look at our webpage today, and then please go back in another month to 2 months, and hopefully you will see something completely different that deeply invites participation. John, and then, well, Jonathan was next, and then John.
If I could just speak on behalf of the designers from last night on the design issue that Hank brings up. We were over lunch, I was joking how I thought Adrian should really run for some kind of political office because he's such a good speaker and as a designer has a real political understanding about the process that we are engaged in as designers, and so I still hope that Adrian will get out there in our community.
I asked him last night about doing that because he said I'm all about politics. So yes. I said, why don't you run for office? And he said, no way.
Yeah, because he's too talented.
I almost got him.
Anyway, but I think and then Peter Marcuse, I think, laid down the gauntlet today when he said that he didn't feel that design had a large role in placemaking, and I wanted to question him a little more on that as he walked out the door, and he said, "Well, I was trying to be provocative," and I think that's but we've been provoked by that comment, and I think that the many of the presentations today, which the DIY and the community initiatives, that I sense there's a scale issue here, that we can operate very well at one scale, and that we don't know how to operate as a community, as a professional design community, at another scale, and that's the scale that we have to get involved in if we want to make a real difference and it's not just bigger buildings, right? But it's being at the table when the issues are being drawn out and the strategy is being created.
John, you had...
Yeah, I wanted to raise something actually very closely related to that. It's been something that I've been a little uneasy about for the whole day, and that is we keep bandying around this idea of the public and community, and we're involving people in the design process, but at no point have we been terribly specific about which people. On any given project, questions are going to arise about, well, if this is for local people, who counts as local? Who counts as a user? Is it the person who lives next door, or is it the person who got on his bike and rode 50 miles and is now sitting there enjoying this space, who feels like they have a stake because that's their regular Saturday ride, but you're not local, you're an incomer. No, so you are going to get these kind of contestations over space, but that's only going to be magnified the larger you get. So you have precisely these kind of arguments over Washington, D.C. I mean, you have these battles between people who consider themselves to be the locals against everyone else who has a sense of ownership of this as their national capital and wanting to have a say in it. The point I want to make about that is that is inevitable. And democracy is not going to solve that problem. Democracy is the means we have to address the conflicts that arise in that. And so often we write about democracy as if it's this magic pill that's going to make conflict vanish. No, democracy is the method we have to address conflict without pulling our guns on each other. That is the thing we do. It's not the magic pill. And so I guess my challenge to everybody is that's part of my general message about being broader in our thinking about what kinds of theory are going to apply, who counts as a public. This will have issue specific. It'll be place specific. It'll be time specific. These dynamics. It might not matter very much on some kinds of public spatial projects, but it matters a great deal on others. And learning to sort out which ones are going to be the problem-causing ones and which ones are not. Again, we don't have a magic pill for that. No. This is welcome to democracy. It is conflict.
Remember that when we say welcome to democracy, we can't necessarily assume that everybody is welcoming democracy, and that's why I'm going to call on Paul right now. Not because Paul doesn't welcome democracy, by the way, just to be clear.
Let me, I'm not sure democracy is the answer.
Yes.
I grew up in South Africa, so so I can say one person who's lived in a non-democracy. The most important thing, there's no point having democracy without having education. Right. And we have the best architectural schools in the world in the United States, but in terms of respect for architects or understanding the importance of design, I think we're very far down. And until we can find a way to educate the kids on the value of design, and I don't mean art, I mean design, we're going to be tough, because we have all this vigorous debate. We have a few great journalists writing about it and pressing, but I'm fear that many of the people reading the articles don't understand. They don't have the education, the non-architects, to understand what the debate is about. So what's the point of the democracy if you're preaching to people who don't actually understand the issues?
Annette?
So I think it adds on with all these. There also needs to be education in architecture of the way that your role in designing space is highly political. I think that's what people who actually practice and have to collaborate and have to are all touching upon, is that your act in this space is part of a larger political system and struggle. And so when we go practice in these different contexts, you're part, and I'm going to emphasize again that it's a property. We're rewriting the social contract in our cities, and we're playing a big part in that. And it's spatial, the way we're rewriting it. And to be more aware of that as we train designers, of that connection, is still missing. Right. But you definitely learn on the job when it happens, right?
To be clear, by the way, Annette's work when it comes to property rights, I might call them more broadly rights, but I think the critical point is that if you even take a space like a sidewalk, there are all of these rights that are being negotiated to the use of that sidewalk, and Annette calls them quite properly. She can call them property rights and uses that kind of literature. I might call them more broadly rights that are being contested in that space, not necessarily property rights. I might call them free speech rights or sort of human rights of a broader nature, but they're all rights-based, contested, negotiated, socially constructed.
I mean, I think that designers have a very important role to play in this problem of public space because they're thinking imaginatively, they're making new things. But I think it's important that we distinguish between different kinds of newness, different kinds of difference. And so for me, what's important is that we address the correct problems. We're producing new things in relation to problems that make sense in relation to public space today, which is why I think the problem of neoliberalism is important. I think we have lots of space, but it's being privatized all around us. And I think that that's a kind of existential privatization that comes through the indebtedness of neoliberalism. We've become very individual people because we live in the shame of our own private debt. And that makes it very hard to actually think collectively. And so I think that this crisis around public space needs to respond to that problem. It's not just about physical spaces. The problem is in physical spaces, but it's a kind of existential problem. And so the answer to that problem is in a process of design which is against that problem, which also responds to that problem, which is why I think we're talking a lot about collaboration. Clearly, if we want to make a process of design that responds to it, we need to be against a kind of individualism in design. That's clear. But we also need to be against certain kinds of consensus and collaboration, which the consensus of professionals, the consensus of BIAs, a kind of closed consensus. That's a little bit what John was just talking about. We need to understand the people, we need to have a kind of solidarity with and collaboration with the people that are affected by the designs. And so I think that we're talking a lot about design as a process in response to specific problems around privatization.
Yeah. Adrian, I did appreciate and thought one of the most significant statements you made was that neoliberal space is not public space. I don't know that I actually agree with that, however, and my concern is, first of all, it eliminates a lot of space. Okay, that's okay. You know, we can do our maps and eliminate all of that. But what it also eliminates is the possibility that simply enjoying, sitting around, having a beer with somebody is not actually a public experience because, I suppose, somebody can't come in up to my table and push me for some non-neoliberal position or reason. That's what I take away from it, and yet, of course, you know, we've talked a lot about all sorts of different activities that may take place in space. Some of them are transgressive, or the Occupy Wall Street variety, trying to change the world in such a wonderful way, which is, I think, what Occupy Wall Street did. We also have to thank Occupy Wall Street, by the way, for reminding people about the importance of physical space, one of the great lateral benefits. In fact, one of my former students blogged afterwards. This came in on something, somebody sent it to me and said, you know, I was a student of this guy, Professor Caden, and I remember when he spent one whole class, an hour and a half, talking about privately owned public space. And I sort of thought it was sort of interesting, but the guy was sort of obsessed with privately owned public space. Now I realize he really, you know, was onto a big hot topic, and he's the luckiest guy who has benefited from Occupy Wall Street. I thought that was very, very cute. You know, they didn't occupy for me, but you know, it did bring back these spaces. So I don't know, I guess I would just push on this and say, what about, though, these other uses in which they're just sort of the daily kinds of things? We've had some questions and comments about that, where people just want to sit down, you know, with friends, read a book, talk to somebody else. They don't want to be confronted. They don't want to be pushed. They just want to have a nice time. And surely beauty and enjoyment and leisure and all these other things are very much part of what the built environment should produce as well, and public space. I don't want to mischaracterize what you're saying, so if I have...
I think it's a little bit of a mischaracterization.
Okay, fair enough.
I would say beer drinking is something that... I was at the beer museum in Guangzhou, at the Zhejiang Beer Museum, and they showed me the Mesopotamian, the Egyptian, the German beer making and beer drinking lifestyles, which preceded neoliberalism.
All right. But they were precursors of it. Are there some final comments here? Florian, please.
No, beer is...
Not about beer, actually. Maybe just one addition. Actually, Henk, you triggered me actually by saying we talked about public place instead of actually public space, and I think we also maybe talked more about the significance of designers than the significance of design. And I think actually in that sense, maybe one addition I do like to make, and it's kind of an old-fashioned one almost, and I think that's actually also good because not everything has to be new all the time. But if we actually want to discuss with non-professionals which designers have to be doing more and more and more, and I think it's a good thing. You also have to know exactly what you're talking about spatially, and then you don't necessarily actually have to be talking to an educated audience or educated collaborators, but more people actually that are willing to listen. And you have to be able to explain also what spatial implications are and how design does matter. Because actually a sidewalk 1 meter less or more wide, or even 50 centimeters actually can make a difference for whatever you want to do there. Okay. The same is actually with height differences. Half a meter is totally different than a meter, than 2.5, etc., etc. And I think actually that comes with having a good design education and really being able to know what you actually spatially design in order to be able to communicate that.
Great. Do you want to say something?
Yeah.
Jeff, you want
Jeff and then Christian.
and then
Adrian, I want to thank you for the comment on the process. Because, and actually that's what Florian also says, on one hand you have to be the best designer in the sense that you have to really know what you're doing. And secondly, you have to be the worst designer, or it doesn't really matter. You have to have other competences to actually engage or reinvent this process. But the process of design is not only defined by the designer, but most of it by all the others in the process. And I'm on the other side. I'm a politician in that sense. We make politics. And we develop design policy already for 25 years, almost 20 years. And it shifted, it started with the beautification of architecture in 1989, where our design policy was architecture policy. And I delivered 2 policy documents in the last four years on the design. It's all about process. It's about the role and positioning of the design and the designer in the broadness of it, being a landscape architect or an urban designer or an architect, or and in addressing that process, it's also about the government, the market, the money, the rules and regulations, and how you deal with that. So being the process so much important for the designer, it's part of becoming the competences of this good designer. So besides knowing everything about height and detail and interaction, you also have to know everything about this new process and the actors involved.
Christian,
I think
okay, we have, if people are okay, we'll go with, we have 3 more, I think, and then we're done. Okay. 4 more? No, 3 more. He was just kidding. Okay. So Christian, please.
Yeah, I'd like to quote sociologist Willem Schinkel, who just wrote a new book, The New Democracy, in which he stated that we're still living in this Greek idea of democracy and looking at the Agora and the Plaza as the ultimate kind of public space. But meanwhile, there has been produced so many different types of public and publicness that it also starts to trigger the question like, okay, what are we and for who are we creating these public spaces? So within the process of what we are into in Rotterdam, we noticed that the democracy itself, as we knew it, was at stake. So it was not the traditional democracy where everybody agreed upon, but indeed turning around the finance or turning around the role of the government from up to down and flipping this process was starting to be part of the design issue. And then, of course, form comes along, but this was design of democracy, and well, That's a quite big thing, but political design in that sense is new competence for architects.
Yeah, Maurice.
No, I was thinking about your turn on the phrase, putting public space in its place, and I think a lot of what we've discussed here, I think, kind of put designers in their place, and really suggested that there are innumerable forces that are at play in which we are not influencing, and it may suggest that designers need to find those strategic places of influence, and I would argue one is very close to politics. Thursday night, the Mayor's Institute was being hosted in New Orleans, and there were 6 big city mayors there. And I sat next to a mayor who was looking at a 400-acre tract of land, a decommissioned military base, where she was imagining a new city. She wanted to imagine a new city there. She had no architectural guidance. She had no architectural confidants. And I'm thinking, as we talk about, we're talking amongst ourselves and we talk about the importance of what we do, it's not getting through to the actual people who have influence at the scales in which we want to operate. And I mean, I was impressed with, the work of West 8 and their service to mayors who have a vision of their cities, an ambitious vision. But it's very hard to find that counterpart here in the United States. And I think it's a place of influence where designers have to be. And I think it quite frankly starts in school in an acknowledgement of the complexities of public placemaking that have been talked about in this conference.
Can I relate to your experience? I was in a MICD last fall, and it's an NEA program, already there for 25 years. And what struck me was when I asked the question, 7 mayors at the table for almost 3 days, very well prepared, 7 experts, the doors closed, everything's on there. I asked the question, what are you going to do when you get home? You are totally lost. You are loaded with knowledge, and nobody knows how to attach to that at home. And there were mayors that had no planning department, no architect, no idea on how to actually deal with the developer, deal with the money they got from the federal government because this tornado came through town, and now they have to redevelop the whole city, and they don't even know what design is. And then they are there, they're totally lost. And the NEA said, you're not allowed to ask that question.
Because we don't have the answer.
Because formally, after these 3 days, you're not allowed to engage anymore.
That's the point.
So then this is crucial in the process in how do you actually position this broadness of design being much more than designers, but being the actors in place that actually help develop or redevelop the situation in those cities, is how do you actually empower a process on such a scale that was ignited in such a 3-day MICD conference.
Yeah. Right. No, the point comes to mind. In the case of Mayor Landrieu in New Orleans, he hired his director of place-based planning. So he took an MIT educated planner and architect and placed him by his side. And he was the one sitting next to him in dinner, talking to him about whether I-10 should come down or not. And that's what I mean by having access and influence where it really, really counts in these large issues. And he told me later that that the political will that it would take to bring down that highway, the mayor is not sure he wants to spend his capital on that. And so he's thinking, the mayor is already thinking about his relationship to his larger constituency, how much political capital he'll have to expend versus the other investments that he's trying to make in the community. I think the kinds of conversations, the realities, the ground truthing that we have when we engage in those on that level are fascinating. And I personally have enormous confidence in the students that I teach because I see an entrepreneurial streak there, a desire to take their educations and their experiences and make them relevant today. There's an impatience there, which I find refreshing, and I applaud. It's a very different generation than ours.
Right. But I would say, by the way, that it doesn't mean that they have to follow, Maurice, your model of having actually been a mayor. You were a mayor, and it doesn't mean that they have to run for office either. And you're not saying that. I understand. And what it does mean, and here's just a silly little idea, see who's going to be running at different times. Spot them before they are mayor. Get to know them. It's actually something one can really do, and say, I want to help you and advise you on planning and design issues for the city, on public space issues for the city. And they're delighted at that time. First of all, they're looking for any vote they can get. They're looking for money as well, but even one vote and free advice. And if you're there before they are mayor, and if you've chosen wisely, you can have an enormous influence.
Great.
Jeff?
Okay. I want to go back to what Paul has said, and I think I'm hoping I'm interpreting this wrong, because I think what you say about education and democracy, there seems to be a presumption that the architects or designers know more about anything than any other people. I think we have one example here, which is we got some of the greatest minds in this room, but we still don't know what public space is. So,
my point is that we need an interaction with the population, and you understood that, right? And without people who speak our language or understand the benefit of the city, in Holland you've had 25 years of an architectural policy, right? I believe that's the EU mandate, so the UK is now writing one, and Terry Farrell is going to spend the next year trying to fathom that out. What do we do in this country? I think, by the time your students, Maurice, have an influence, it might be too late. I mean, we need to move quite quickly to change things over here. And how do we do that? You've got the answer, right?
Okay. Well,
I don't know if I have the answer, but just a comment. I mean, what we're talking about is an informed dialogue between designers and the public, the people who use the spaces and the people who shape them. I think this conference has been enormously valuable in enhancing that dialogue and in sharpening minds, even if it hasn't definitively answered the question of what is a public space. And in that sense, I mean, I think what we've gone through is enormously valuable. We are judged as much by the spaces that we create as by the objects we create, the voids as much as the solids, and they are signatures of our civilization as much as any object that a starchitect does. And the stakes are enormously high, and so that's the value of what you've organized, Gerald. And so, thank you.
well, thanks very, very much.
Let's applaud to them.
Thank you very, very much. So, final thing, let me thank the speakers who are still here and moderators. Adrian back there, thank you very, very much. Susan, you're right here, thank you very much. Piper, John, Annette, Jonathan, Florian, Jeff, Christian, Blair, Paul, Maurice, Hank Ovink, and Ben Prosky there. Emily, are you here? Thank you very, very much. Chantal, I don't see here, Blakely, but they, again, put together this conference administratively and wouldn't have happened without it. And again, thank you to all of you for braving the weather, braving the time. Have a wonderful Friday evening and a wonderful weekend. So thank you all. And Hank Ovink, thank you very, very much, Hank. It's great.
Very good.